This chapter is about non-specific defenses of the host, and here specifically we're going to be talking about innate immunity. Innate means that's the type of immunity that you're born with it. So we're going to take first a look at the big picture in immunology or your immunity, and really you should think of the immune system as a three-tiered system, and we have sort of these physical barriers which are represented by skin, mucous membranes, antimicrobial substances. And then we have our second line of defense. That would be inflammation, fever, phagocytic cells, such as macrophages and neutrophils. And then we have humoral and cellular immunity, and that hinges entirely on your lymphocytes. Which they can differentiate into B cells and T cells. And where the cellular immunity, that will be T cells, and the humoral or antibody mediated immunity, that would be B cells. Kind of picture this like how you would protect your home. First, you want to have some physical barriers. You want to have some fencing, some walls. Maybe you live in a gated community where you have extra sort of barriers there. Those are physical barriers that keep unwanted people, in this case, or unwanted things out. And you're, in the case of your immune system and your body, that would be the skin, mucous membranes. Stomach acidity would count for that too. So physical barriers are relatively easy to understand. The third line of defense is also relatively easy to understand. That is when your enemy is deep in your body or deep in your house, to use that picture. And now you need to come up with a strategy. So now you need to get specific answers. You need to make sure that you understand what are the strengths and the weaknesses of my enemy, and then make specific weapons against that, the weaknesses that are aimed against the weaknesses of your pathogen. So in the case of the immune system, that will be to make antibodies that are specifically designed to bind and mark and label pathogens. And then also we have our cell-mediated immunity that will be mediated by T cells that are cytotoxic, or they help T cells, they activate other lines of defense that you have in your immune system. So the first line of defense and the third line of defense are relatively easy to understand. The second line is more complex, and there's more components to it, and so therefore, as long as you know the first line of defense and the third line of defense, then if it, whatever you're being asked to answer, which line of defense it belongs into, if it doesn't fit either the first line or third line category, you just know it's going to have to be second line of defense. Now picture the second line of defense as follows. So the enemy, some burglar, let's say, has overcome your security system, has jumped the fence, or has been just somehow smashed a window and it's gotten into your house. And now they're in the house, and they want to take stuff that you don't want them to have. And so now what do? The first thing you would do is kind of non-specifically try to limit the area where the enemy can go. So maybe you want to shut down some gates or some doors and try to limit the area where the people that you don't want in your house, where they could go. So you throw sort of non-specific barriers at them. Maybe you're going to throw some dishes, or I don't know, in the old days, I guess this would be the archers. They're coming out and they're trying to, with bow and arrow, just shoot some of the enemies. So anyway, a second line of defense, you have a variety of options in the human body, and that would be inflammation, it would be fever, it would be the complement system, it's also phagocytes such as neutrophils and macrophages. So you have a variety of options here, but they're all aimed at limiting the area where the pathogens can migrate to, limiting further entry and deeper entry into your body, trying to keep it localized, and then take care of it, with the rest of your immune system. So the second line of defense is aimed at limiting the entry of the pathogen into the rest of your body. So keep it localized. And then once that's overrun, now let's say the enemy is in your house roaming around everywhere, and now it's really time to make a strategy, and that's when you need to employ the services of your lymphocytes. Now they can differentiate into B cells, which make antibodies, and then T cells, which they engage in cytotoxic and cell-mediated sort of cell-to-cell combat. Anyway, this is your overview over the immune system as a whole, but this lecture is mostly focusing on your innate immunity. That's the type of immunity that you're born with, which includes mostly sort of first line of defense stuff. So here, the big picture, cells that are participating in the different lines of defense. You are born with white blood cells, such as basophils, eosinophils, mast cells, that will basically contribute to inflammation, which is also second line of defense, but they they mediate inflammation. But you're born with it, and therefore it's part of your innate immune functions. Adaptive immunity down here, that is the kind of immunity that you develop as you go through life and you get exposed to pathogens and you develop resistance, make antibodies against certain things. And so that revolves mostly around lymphocytes that differentiate into B cells, which make antibodies, and T cells, which engage in cell-mediated immune functions. And then here are some cells of the immune system that are mostly phagocytic. Your biggest phagocytic cell, the one cell that's most numerous among your white blood cells, is the neutrophil. The monocyte is called monocyte when it's in circulation. Once it's migrating into tissues, it has a different name. It's called a macrophage, also highly phagocytic. So these two, the bulk of your phagocytic activity. And then we have also some natural killer cells and some dendritic cells. And all of these will be part of the various lectures that are coming now. So you have 4 lectures on the immune system. And we're just starting out first with the easy stuff, with the innate immunity. But here's some more sort of overview over the immune functions. The white blood cells, that is the kind of leukocytes, or white blood cells literally means, leukos means white in Greek. So these are the white blood cells in your blood. If you have high white blood cell count, it's usually a sign that you're going through some sort of infection. You may also have autoimmune disease. That could be sometimes as a side effect of a medication. You might also have high white blood cell count. Low white blood cell counts are more indicative of a viral infection, and or you might have pneumonia. It could also be cancers. Now you see that autoimmune disease could be going either way. It could be either high or low white blood cell count. So there's different options on this, but more likely high. The big picture here, another item. If you are centrifuging blood, then you will separate it into the solid portion, which includes all the cells, all the cellular components. It will be white blood cells and red blood cells. And that's about 45% of whole blood is cells. White blood cells are just a little buffy coat that sits on top here, and then the vast majority is red blood cells. The liquid portion of the blood is called the plasma right here. So that's the plasma. And that should be about 55% of your whole blood. Normal counts of white blood cells and red blood cells, I'll give you that. So right now we're focusing on the immune system, so it's white blood cells. You should have about 5,000 to 10,000 white blood cells per cubic millimeter. That's per microliter of blood. Or you can translate it, of course, times 10 to the ninth for white blood cells per liter. Approximately here are the distributions of the different white blood cells. The vast majority of your white blood cells should be neutrophils, about 2/3 or so, 60 to 70% here of your white blood cells should be neutrophils. And then you have lymphocytes, about 1/5 to 1/4 of your white blood cells should be lymphocytes, and then relatively small numbers, monocytes, about 3 to 8%, so roughly about 5%. The reason for that is that monocytes migrate into tissues and become macrophages. Eosinophils, you should have about 2 to 4%. They do increase when you have eukaryotic parasitic infections, such as like worm infections. And basophils, they almost immediately migrate into tissues where they become mast cells, and so therefore you have only a very small percentage of your circulating white blood cells are basophils. Okay, so now so if we're going to really go into the topic more of this chapter, you need to know here some terms. Immunity is the term that we use to say that it's your ability to ward off disease. Susceptibility is the lack of resistance to a disease, meaning it's easier to get it. Innate immunity is the amount of immunity that you have at birth, and so you're born with it. That's innate immunity. Adaptive immunity is the part of your immune system that you acquire as you go through life. So it's the resistance that you acquire to specific pathogens as you get exposed to them. Okay, here's a concept that you may or may not have heard about, sort of that the binding of a pathogen to a certain receptor on your cells, on host cells, that causes then a chain reaction of events that then results in an immune response. So toll-like receptors, abbreviated TLRs, on host cells attached to pathogen-associated molecular patterns or surface structures on a pathogen. It could be the spike proteins on a virus or surface antigens on a bacterium. So these pathogen-associated molecular patterns, they bind to receptors on your cells. And that binding induces the release of cytokines. So once the pathogen has bound to your cellular structures, that induces the release of cytokines from the host cell that regulate the intensity and the duration of the immune responses. So you can check your understanding really briefly. Which defense system, innate or adaptive, prevents entry of microbes into the body? And of course, that would be innate. And what relationship do TLRs have to pathogen-associated molecular patterns? Well, these toll-like receptors, those are on your cells, on the host cells. And then the pathogen-associated molecular patterns, those are the surface structures that identify a pathogen. So now let's talk about innate immunity. So the immunity or the resistance to pathogens that you're born with. Let's first talk about physical factors. First thing that comes to mind is unbroken skin. Your healthy, normal, unbroken skin. It has several layers, and the outer layers contain keratin. These cells are filled up with keratin, which waterproofs the skin and really creates a great barrier for entry. So the shedding, the dryness of the skin inhibits microbial growth, and it also creates a perfect barrier to microbial entry. Here are the layers of the skin. You can see here the epidermis, it's on top. These cells are all dead. They're filled up with keratin and they form a protective layer that's waterproof and does not allow for entry of microorganisms. And then underneath here we have the dermis, much deeper laying tissue. So physical factors continued here would be also mucous membranes. Now mucous membranes, they're moist, and so that's much more of the type of growth medium that bacteria would like. And so you need to put stuff on top of your mucous membranes to really limit the growth of microorganisms. But mucous membranes, that's always the epithelial layers that line the gastrointestinal tract, respiratory tract, and genitourinary tracts. You have lots of mucous membranes in your body, in your mouth, your nose, so there's lots of them. A lot of times we are secreting mucus, which is a viscous glycoprotein that traps microbes and prevents tracts from drying out. So mucus is kind of a great substance. It keeps everything moist, but it also protects and traps microbes so they can't really penetrate. Here's another thing, lacrimal apparatus, your tears. They contain also IgA type of antibodies, sort of a generic antibody that binds to stuff that's not supposed to be around your eyes, like bacteria. It drains and washes your eyes, and so and also any kind of bacteria that were trapped there, they could be washed out because the tear fluid drains your eyes. So here will be the lacrimal gland that sort of flush and cleanse your your eyes. Let's continue with the physical factors on the next section.